We've talked so far about overarching principles of document design. We've talked about page-level principles of document design, and now we've also talked about paragraph levels of document design. We're going to get down more granular and talk about font-level principles of document design. To begin, we need to differentiate between two things, typefaces and fonts. People usually say the word font when they mean typeface. So if you think about this, a typeface is a set of letter shapes that have a common design. There's another name for that. It's a font family. A font is a particular variation of a typeface. So for example, if we look at this list here, look at all these. Gill Sans Light, Light Italic, Regular Italic, Bold, Bold Italic, Extra Bold, Ultra Bold, Condensed, Bold Condensed, Ultra Bold Condensed. These are all part of a font family. The shapes are all slightly different from each other, but they all have the same basic characteristics. So these things here, these are typefaces. This is a common typeface with individual fonts. So then we can also break it down further and say that, okay, Gill Sans Light. Gill Sans Light 12 point is a different font than Gill Sans Light 14 point, then 16 point, then 18 point. So every time we put in some sort of variation in here, that is actually technically a different font. That being said, nobody really cares. Matter of fact, I will often interchange the word font and typeface, but there is a technical difference. And if you really want to get in good with your wherever you go work, if you work at a big company and you want to get in good with the graphic designers there, start talking about the difference between fonts and typefaces and use the terms correctly, you'll make a friend and they will love you and they'll probably do cool things for you. So that's typeface versus font. The thing that you need to know about them is typefaces are done and created for different purposes. They are not all the same. You can't just sub one in and call it good. Some typefaces are done for a particular purpose, and they are good for only that purpose. Some typefaces, they're found on one computer but not another computer, or one OS and not another OS. Every typeface has a different kind of personality, and you also need to make sure that the typeface matches the message you are trying to send. Let's look at some examples of what's going on here. So in terms of personalities, how would you describe these 6 different fonts, these 6 different typefaces? So if we look at the one on top, is it serious? Top left, serious? No, it's sort of playful. How about the second one down in the middle left? Serious? Well, more serious. How about the very bottom one? Is that a playful font? Is that a serious font? Well, what sort of personality does it have? What sort of characteristics would you want to hang out with this font? Take a look on the right-hand side. Up the top, the dreaded Comic Sans. It's friendly, isn't it? Then we have the one below it. It's more serious. And then we have the super serious, sort of really fancy one down below. So each of these things has a different personality of a sort. The message being sent has to match up with that particular personality. Which of these would be appropriate? Well, I look at these and I kind of like, well, I don't know. Gee, would the top one work? Well, it's all right. It's not bad. The second one down, probably not unless you are talking about somebody who's writing to the Addams Family. The next one down, it's all right. It's a little too serious. Ooh, Comic Sans. That might be good. Ooh, the Scripty. You're great. That's sort of fun, interesting. The Algerian at the bottom. Hey, that's all sorts of fun and fancy. So you want to make sure that the message you are sending matches up. Similarly, what if you want to send this message, and I would not necessarily want to send it in text. You'd probably want to do this face-to-face, but let's assume that you had to do it by text. Which one would be most appropriate? Odds are the first and the third would be the most appropriate. They are businesslike. They are serious. Which ones would be inappropriate? Well, all the rest. And I would suggest definitely the second one would be hideously inappropriate. Then, sometimes bands, for example, or brands, they will have their own special typeface that they use to show that, hey, this is us. This shows something about us. It carries our personalities. So what we've done here is this particular image, this is from the back of a CD. It's by a band named Flotsam and Jetsam. What genre of music is this band? Think about it. You look at those letters and you probably the answer is, yeah, this is a metal band. How do I know? Well, these are fonts that are used by metal bands that we've seen these before. These are actually all famous typefaces. Now, I'm not going to go through each of these and talk about them individually. What I would recommend that you do, if you have a couple of minutes, is go take the extra credit quiz. I'm going to ask you, do you know what fonts, what bands are represented by these various fonts? If you do, cool. You can get yourself a couple of extra credit points. If you don't worry about it. It's not going to hurt you. Then, point size. Text is measured in points. 1 point is 1/72nd of an inch, or 0.01384 inches. Do you need to write this down? Not necessarily. If you're going to write it down, go with the 1/72nd of an inch. The thing is that even though text is measured in points, fonts that have the same point size, they're not necessarily the same physical size on the page or on the screen. That's an artifact that has to do with how remember I talked about when printing presses were developed, letters were actually made on physical chunks of metal and then put into a rack. Well, that's what's going on here. So these differences in point size that don't exactly match up, that goes with the layout of how the letter is laid out on these chunks of metal. So I want to give you an example of what's going on here. Take a look at all of these. Same text, it says Lorem Ipsum, Lorem Ipsum, Lorem Ipsum. They're all 36 point, but the typefaces are different and the physical size is also very different. So if we look at Baskerville Oldface and Chiller, well, the one Baskerville Oldface looks a lot taller, it looks a lot wider. Absolutely it is. But these are still 36 point. So why is this important? When you start laying out documents, think about your point size, but don't just rely on point size. Play with it. See what it actually looks like, then adjust the point size to fit. Let's talk sans and serif and sans serif. There are multiple different types of typefaces, but there are two major categories you need to know about. Serif is a tail on a letter. Sans is a French word, it means without. So sans serif letters don't have any tails on the ends. So remember this again, serif and sans serif. The ones on the left here, these are all serif fonts. The ones on the right, these are all sans serif fonts. So on the left, serif, on the right, sans serif. Take a look at some of the differences. How about this F and this F? Notice what's going on. I have a serif on the left, no serif on the right, serif on the left, no serif on the right, serif on the left, no serif on the right, serif on the left, no serif on the right. So this is where you look for serifs. This is how the letter shapes are different. Remember we talked contrast earlier in this video, or actually previous in this PowerPoint series. This is one way you can create contrast very easily, is by using serif and sans serif fonts. Also, individual typefaces, individual fonts inside these major categories can be very different. So if we look at this, each of those is very different from each other, isn't it? Take a look at the thickness there and the amount of ink, the angle of that curve. It's called the shoulder, by the way. So look at the thickness there. It's much thicker than the one circled in green. And it's got a much steeper angle. There, that's super thick. Oh, but it's got a super wide angle. So when you are choosing fonts, make sure that they create contrast when you need to. For example, if you want to use serif and sans serif, it would be a good idea, generally speaking, to use serif for main body text on paper documents, sans serif for other things, like the headings. You want to make sure that there is contrast between the two, but you also want them to have some consistent design elements so that they look like they belong on the same page. It's a balancing act. you just need to practice back and forth. And before you ask, no, I can't tell you, you should always use font A with font B. It's up to you. You have to figure out and experiment, find out what works. And of course, a little typographic humor. When do you use these things? As I mentioned before, Americans generally, we like serif typefaces as main body text on paper. Europeans, on the other hand, they're used to sans serif main text on paper. Why is that? It's just cultural, no particular reason why. Sans serif also is easier to read if it's very small or very far away. So if you have text that is really, really tiny, I would recommend making it sans serif. It'll come out better. It won't come out it will not come out as a blob on the paper. Also, think about this. You're driving down the freeway. Those green and silvery white signs, what kind of text is that you see there? Is it serif or sans serif? Yeah, highway signs are always sans serif. That's because it's easier to read if it's very far away. Also, when do you use them? Use them to create contrast, as I mentioned before, and generally speaking, when your main body is serif, use sans serif on headings, headers, captions, things like that. Check this out. Sans serif is a good bet for using on-screen or online. For example, all this text here, this is all sans serif. I'm putting this PowerPoint up on a video screen. If I were doing it in person, it would be on a projection screen. So this is a good choice. Then, serif fonts that have thick serifs, those things are good for on-screen use. So, and what I've just circled up there, this is a good serif font for on-screen. This is Georgia. Notice, take a look at those serifs. They are all thick and blunt. If you use a serif font with a very thin serif, for example, what I'm using right now on this text, this is not a good choice because it fuzzes out. Now, if it's blown up real big, it'll work, but if it's even the slightest bit tiny, you'll start to get what you call dithering on the screen, and the little thin serifs will start to go into a gray mush. It's really bad design. So, use serif fonts with thick serifs for on-screen use. Use serifs or use sans serif as your main text for online or on screen. And just as a note, Georgia and Verdana, these things are both screen-only typefaces. If you use Georgia on a printed page, it will suck an ink cartridge dry. Verdana on a piece of paper, it just looks kind of funny. You reserve those two typefaces for the screen. Then, italics and underlining. Please note, the computer is not, etc., a typewriter. Underlining was a creation of necessity. It's because, back in the day, manual typewriters, these things did not operate on electricity, they couldn't do italics. Look at that little array of things down in the middle there, that sort of curved bit. What we've got going on there is a striker arm with two faces. You got the lower one toward the angle where it bends, where that backward 4 is. That is the one that usually hits. Then you have a shift key, and the shift key would actually adjust the guts of the entire thing and move that entire array of silver keys downward, so that when someone hit the key, that would come up and it would touch the tip instead and make the dollar sign. So that's why we call it the shift key. It would actually shift the guts of the machine. Anyway, manual typewriters can't do italics because you've only got so much room for so many striker keys. If you wanted to do italics, you would have to either include a whole new, you'd have to double, literally you'd have to double the size of the typewriter and include a whole new set of keys to strike, and it would make it super complex. They only got around that in, I think, the 1960s and 70s when they came up with the, trying to remember what it was called, the Daisy head printer, or, it's not coming to me. But the IBM Selectric, you could actually pop out a little rotating head instead of using these striker arms. Anyway, underlining was a creation of necessity. They realized, you know what we're going to do? We're going to use the hyphen key. We'll shift it down, and instead of making hyphens, we'll just have it go under the baseline. So people can backspace, shift, hyphen, 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 and it'll make underlines instead of italicizing. That's why we have underlines. So you want to make sure that in today, when you're using the computer, italics have replaced underlining. If somebody is going to tell you to underline, don't. Only thing you're going to underline, I mean only with an asterisk, is a URL or email address. And that's particularly if you're just doing black and white documents, for example on paper, where someone cannot click a live link. So in that case, you definitely want to underline it. And if somebody tells you that, oh yeah, you shouldn't italicize that, you should underline it, that person is one of these and they should be ignored.